Hi there, welcome back to the Community of Readers video blog. We're following the Old Testament readings for the Monkey Bar Challenge, and this week we're looking at the whole of the book of Jeremiah for the first time. This is called Coward or Hero. Jeremiah is the first prophet after Zephaniah that we looked at last week. And Jeremiah is really interesting. He's one of the big three. There's Isaiah, there's Ezekiel, and there's Jeremiah. But Jeremiah is the prophet who gives us the closest account of those years running up to the Babylonian exile. Isaiah, as we said before, was from about 100 years prior to that. But then the tradition of Isaiah takes us through the exile and out the other side into this post-exilic world. And the same sort of is true for Ezekiel. It's really from more or less within the period of the Babylonian exile. So really it's only Jeremiah that gives us that kind of real window on this time. Now Jeremiah as a book is interesting as a collection of prophecies because it's more of an anthology than it is any kind of chronology. It doesn't really have a story particularly that goes through it, at least not one that makes much sense on first reading. The way that we need to understand Jeremiah is to try and understand some of the huge geopolitical upheaval that was going on that gives context to what he was doing, and so in the kingdom of Judah and how they were responding to his prophecies. So let's just chart a few moments through that journey that he had. So we mentioned last week with Nahum, in 612 BC, the Babylonians defeated the Assyrian Empire. Now this was a massive, massive deal because the Assyrians have been this huge empire for ages. I mean, literally for over 100 years. And they had been the ones that had invaded the kingdom of Israel. But they just got too big. They'd stretched out to the east, they were trying to come south, they were having to keep the hordes in the north at bay, and it just got too much. And Babylon finally inflicted that hammer blow that signalled the end of the empire. But it wasn't like overnight suddenly Assyria disappeared and suddenly Babylonia was in charge of everywhere. That defeat signalled a power vacuum. You had Assyria in the north, waning, Babylonia in the east, rising, and Egypt in the south. Strong, not too strong, but strong enough to create space for Judah, and particularly King Josiah, who was stampeding through all of his religious reforms that we read about in Kings and Chronicles. And he was doing so much reforming, he was even managing to create reforms into the land that had previously been called Israel, that would technically belong to Assyria, but there was just such a lack of real power in that region that Josiah was moving northward into that land. So there's a really interesting situation going on. But it didn't last too long, because in 609, I can't remember what happened in 609, but it's definitely a very important date in my head. Ah yes, in 609, Egypt, Judah had become Egypt's vassal, so Egypt was in control of Judah. But then only 4 years later, in 605, Babylon finally defeated Egypt at Carchemish, and that was the moment that a new world order had arrived. No longer looking south, Judah looked east and paid her tribute there. About 7 years passed, and the king of Judah at that point had been Jehoiakim, whom Egypt had put on the throne, replacing Jehoahaz with Jehoiakim as like a puppet king. And Jehoiakim's son Jehoiachin was on the throne when in 598 Babylon finally invaded Judah. And that was really the moment that the nation of Judah fell. And they installed their own puppet king, Zedekiah. And they carried Jehoiachin away in exile to Babylon. But they kept him as the rightful king, which, as you can understand, is a move of oppression, really, because you can't function as a state if your king is in the dungeon of another superpower. Anyway, Zedekiah was puppet king of Judah. And this is an interesting moment in Jerusalem's life, because there are really three kind of different political visions for the city. So there's the pro-Babylonians, the movement that says, look, this is where it's going. Let's not fight them. Let's work with them. Let's make peace and prosper in as good a relationship with this empire as we possibly can. And then you had the pro-Egyptians who said, look, Egypt are much better off. We're much better getting an alliance with Egypt. Together we could beat the Babylonians. But the strongest voice of all is the pro-independence movement, who say, what are we talking about? This is the land given us by Yahweh on promise. We don't negotiate with anyone. We are the great people of God and we should have our independence. And that was the voice that spoke the loudest. And that was the voice that Zedekiah heard and amplified, and what brought about the crushing siege of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar and the final destruction of the city in 587. This is the moment that we know so well. That's the moment of the real final exile to Babylon from Jerusalem. Now the exile is interesting because actually, relatively speaking, only a very small number of people actually go from Judah to Babylon. It's a very significant demographic. It's all of the leaders, it's the artisans, it's the people who are educated, who are skilled. So once you take them away, it has a massive destabilising effect on the people left behind. But actually most people were left behind. And interestingly, Jeremiah was one of them. He stayed behind as prophet for those abandoned by the effects of the exile. But they actually didn't stay there long, because there was a rebellion against the Babylonian governor now of Judea, Gedaliah, and people had to flee to Egypt because they were afraid of Babylonian retribution for this rebellion. And so Jeremiah fled with them, with Baruch his scribe. And that is the ignominious even end to his life and ministry. So Jeremiah is an interesting character, because one of the things that Jeremiah is doing in his ministry is trying to challenge the insanity of the pro-independence movement, or the insanity as he sees it in any case. He doesn't see that as faithfulness to Yahweh. Jeremiah is part of the pro-Babylonian movement. He says this is faithfulness to Yahweh, to understand our limits, to understand who we are at this moment. To just get carried away with this kind of rampant nationalism just for the sake of it. That isn't what we're called to do, says Jeremiah. We're called to understand who we are as the people of God in this moment. And this makes Jeremiah quite different from many of the other messages that we find in the Old Testament. Jeremiah really suffers for the decisions that he makes. He gets put in prison for just speaking out on this opinion. In fact, the king asks him what he thinks, and then when Jeremiah tells him, he throws him in prison. He gets thrown in a muddy cistern, and generally people hate him. He has a sorry life, and we'll look much more at that next week. But Jeremiah's wisdom is very clear. Unthinking nationalism will not save us. It will only serve to destroy us. Now Jeremiah is, of course, proved right. It did destroy them. But the fact that he failed to convince people, I find very sobering, especially for a man whom we now regard as such an incredible prophet, to have in his lifetime so utterly failed to achieve what he set out to do. He was right, but he couldn't get commitment from those around him. We might be the visionaries of our day, those who are trying to win others over, who can see clearly the path ahead and know coolly and calmly this is what we must do. But I suspect that actually most of us are really the stubborn sheep who refuse to leave the pen, even though there's wonderful countryside out there, just because we don't know what that means. We'd rather stick with what we're familiar with, rather than really take the risks. And Jeremiah cautions us that great evil can be done simply by being scared. And there is nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong in seeking peace and prosperity and the comfort of safety. But when life inflicts itself upon us, which it does, then we have that choice. We have that choice. Do we stick our heads in the sand like the people of Israel did? Or do we put our hearts on the line in the cause of what is right? Jeremiah, the story of Jeremiah reminds us that Judah was just a pawn in an international game of empire chess. But she taught like a queen. For some, that might be plucky courage in the face of oppression. But for Jeremiah, it was unfaithful arrogance in the face of her suzerain, Yahweh. Eventually, that arrogance caused her to be knocked off the board. But this was not checkmate. There were many more moves for the people of God to sit and watch.